Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's Next in Compliance. I'm your host, Matt Kelly, and today we have a special guest, Hui Chen, former compliance counsel at the fraud section of the U.S. Justice Department. As many of you may already know, Hui Chen was named to that role in October 2015. She was the Justice Department's first ever in-house compliance counsel. Her role there was to be somebody with industry experience as a corporate compliance officer, and she could then help prosecutors evaluate a company's corporate compliance program when that company was under investigation. Now, Hui left that position on June 23, 1 week ago, and that is several months ahead of the expiration of her full 2-year contract. And Hui Chen has made no bones about it and said publicly that she left because of the ethical challenges the Trump administration faces. That is to say, she found it very difficult to talk to companies under investigation about their tone at the top and problems they might have, when the tone at the top of the Trump administration itself is riddled with exactly the same sort of challenges. So, deep breath here. That is the political end of Hui Chen's departure from the Justice Department, and we are not here to talk about that today. If you are interested in that, there is plenty of coverage of it online. You can find some at Radical Compliance. I'm sure you can find it elsewhere as well. But we actually are here today to talk shop about corporate compliance. In February, Hui Chen helped to publish the Justice Department's guidelines on evaluating the effectiveness of corporate compliance programs. It's a very comprehensive document. It is in the form of a series of questions that prosecutors might potentially ask a company under investigation about its compliance program and how the compliance program works. So Hui is here today to talk with us more about where that guidance came from and how she would recommend that compliance officers put it to good use. So, without any further delay here, Hui Chen, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's a pleasure to be talking with you.
So, my very first question then, I'll just ask, how did this guidance come about in the first place? What made you and your colleagues at the fraud section look out at the landscape and say, we need to put together something that looks like this effectiveness guidance? What was the backstory there?
Sure. So it came about in a couple of ways, and sort of like a merger of two streams. One stream was the initial seed of this was from the first training I did for the fraud section prosecutors in December 2015, shortly after I started there. And I walked through the components of compliance programs and talked about how I would be probing companies on these topics. Then, as I started to have the opportunity to sit in on compliance presentations, I felt repeatedly like companies were not presenting the information that would be helpful to us. For example, they would bring in volumes of their policies, and the amount of trees killed by these presentations always exasperated the environmentalist in me. But when I asked them if they have ever disciplined people under those policies or how specific controls would work, I would get blank stares. They would show us posters of their hotlines, but then when I asked about the actual reporting data and how they use that reporting data to help detect misconduct, I would again get the blank stares. So Andrew Weissman and I discussed how it would be helpful to publish the questions that we asked to help companies prepare for these presentations. The questions would also help prosecutors in assessing the programs. We wanted people to see that we put a lot of emphasis on evidence and data. So don't just tell us that you have a hotline. Show us how how you know it's working and how you're using the information that you gain from these hotlines. And when you say you have a great compliance portal, don't just show us screenshots of it. Show us the hit rates and how you use that data to help you refine how you communicate with your audience. And if you tell us you have a strong tone at the top, show us what concrete actions your leaders have taken personally to demonstrate that. So it's not just some words that they say, tell us what they did. So that's really sort of the various impetus that went into this document.
Okay. And I know that earlier in the week, as we were preparing for this podcast, you had mentioned to me that you're not totally enamored with people calling it guidance per se. It's going to be an uphill battle to get them not to call it guidance, but I don't know if you had any thoughts about how would you actually describe what this is and what it's supposed to be?
So I would describe it as, you're right. I have very much resisted calling it guidance or guidelines. I mean, even as we formulated this document internally. And My reasons are that, to me, guidance tells people what to do. Questions invite people to think. And so I like to call them evaluation questions. And my goal is really to get people to really think about what they're doing. What is the goal they're trying to accomplish? How are they going to measure the results? How do they know it's working? I'm a big fan of asking questions, and the result of that, I'm hoping, is that people really get to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and how do they know that they're successful at it.
Mm-hmm. So the questions in the document itself, like I said earlier, this is comprehensive. There's a lot of stuff in there covering 11 different categories of big areas of concern, with multiple specific points under each category, and then multiple specific questions per point. So I'm wondering if you could say that, is there any single category that is more important or that you saw was more problematic than any others? I'll just give one quick example. As I know, the section on policies and procedures is the single largest category in the whole list of questions. So immediately I wonder, well, okay, is that because it's the most challenging, or it's where you saw the most problems, or did you just wind up asking yourself the most questions? Like, what's the logic to the structure of all of this?
So sort of as a back point, the structure, I really heavily relied on the FCPA resource guide that was published by Justice Department and Securities and Exchange Commission a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And so that really was 10 of the 11 components. And then the 11th component, so to speak, was really something that I, again, going on this thinking mode. To me, it's very important that companies begin by looking at what happened, and that really drives everything in terms of their presentation to the Justice Department. Now, keep in mind, Justice Department is a prosecuting agency, so it is not a regulator. It's not out there to look at compliance programs just for the heck of it. It's looking at a company's compliance program in the context of a criminal investigation. So that leads me to the point that the use of those questions are entirely driven by the circumstances of the case. So, for example, in cases dealing with quality control, like VW or Takata, we didn't ask much questions about third parties or financial controls, because that really had nothing to do, or very little to do, with the misconduct at the core of the issue. So I would say that when I was drafting it, I probably ended up with more questions on policies and procedures, because that was an area where I was most unsatisfied by the then existing focus in that area, which was essentially whether companies had policies and procedures. My interests were far beyond that. I want to know how the policies and procedures were developed and integrated. I want to understand the thought process and the actual operations. Ironically, though, the policy and procedures were probably asked the least often, only because most of the time, when the companies come before DOJ for a presentation, they were well past the stage of policy development, and the nature of the misconduct would lead us to more specific areas than the general policy development. And then actually, this one of the amusing things to me was seeing people like counting the questions. I think I was reading something about this document, and when people pointed it out that it had the policy and procedures had the greatest coverage, and that frankly never even occurred to me. I think, or it never even occurred to any of us as we were reviewing the documents. So when I work with prosecutors to prepare companies for compliance presentations, in terms of preparing them on expectations on what kind of questions we'll be focusing on, I always made sure that I got a full understanding of the facts of the case. So it's always the facts that drive the questions as to their usage. Okay, so I first am going to confess, I am one of those people who counted the questions. And then, but it does lead me into the other question I had on my mind. For the vast majority of compliance officers out there whose companies are not under investigation, and they are not under any immediate trouble where they need to be answering things in front of a prosecutorial office, how could they take this document and then put it to good use internally for the sake of good compliance? And I know the guidance itself says this is not a checklist, but then how would you recommend that a compliance officer sort of reverse engineer the structures they should have at their business based on these kind of questions that might get asked
if something were to go wrong and they were in front of the fraud section?
Yeah, so I think the way I would use it as a compliance officer was I would turn that first risk assessment into any type of, so the first root cause analysis set of questions. I think that set of questions needs to be asked of any type of manifested risk that the compliance officer sees. So, I'm known for sometimes digging into what people literally said to my face, "You're really getting to the nitty gritty of this." And I said, well, the compliance is all about the nitty gritty of things. So if you can't pay attention to small failures that might have resulted in no harm at all, then you are going to end up missing the failures that do result in harm. So I think every time when you see a problem as a compliance officer, you want to do that root cause analysis. You had an approval, something got approved or did not get approved before it happened. Mm-hmm. No harm was done, but why? Why did that system fail? Was it because the person who was doing the approval was too busy? Was it because people didn't understand? They really need to think through that. So that's sort of at the more micro level. At the more macro level, I think what I would like to encourage is people looking at the structure of their compliance program in the context of their company's risks. So, think through what are the different risks that people, that your company faces, and think about how each of these elements actually could impact on how you manage and deal with that risk. So I would use the structure of it. I would use the approach of, that I hope is consistently clear through the document, is the quest for thinking through what you want to accomplish, how you're going to do it, who are you going to work with to accomplish those things, and how are you going to measure the results? What data are you going to need to collect to inform your decisions along the way? So I think those are really at the core what drives what underlie all of those questions. And I would try to think of them in those ways in terms of the big picture goals. How are you getting there, and how do you measure the results?
Okay, and so next question, I did see that not long ago you had a post on LinkedIn. You were talking about your departure from the fraud section.
And you had said that a lot of people talking about or writing about the guidance had somehow misinterpreted the document in any of various ways. So tell us a little more about what you mean there. What sort of misinterpretations have you seen, and what do you wish people would understand more clearly from your perspective?
So honestly, a lot of it, I would read something briefly and I just throw up my hands or roll my eyes after I read or hear something and then forgot about it. There is a professor with whom I've begun collaboration on some projects, and he very much gets the content of the intent of the questions. And as part of his research, he goes to a lot of compliance trainings, and he tells me that what is being talked about is not anywhere near what I was thinking. He didn't want to tell me more, I think because he was afraid that I was just going to be too exasperated if I heard the details. So I'll mention a couple of things. So specifically, one aspect is what we talked about, this prevalence on calling it guidance. And I think the other area that I sometimes get frustrated is that I feel like the questions have not propelled the level of thinking that I was hoping for. For example, I've been told that when people are looking at the question about how do you assess the effectiveness of your training, they revert straight back to the completion or attendance rates. Now, how is that effectiveness? And that is effectiveness if you just want people to check the training box so that you can say 9 out of 10 people did the training. So that's effective. Your goal is just to show somebody that you did the training, but that doesn't really answer the question of whether your training is working in accomplishing anything other than possibly wasting people's time. So I think I sometimes get a little frustrated when I feel, again, my ability to engage, as I mentioned, was very limited due to the limitations placed on me. So I felt like it would have been helpful if I were out there and really engaging people in asking them, like, what do you think this actually means? Because I don't want people to get into the sort of the superficiality of it. I want them to really, dig into this and say, what does this mean for me? And I think that, and how does this change the way I do things? So I think I certainly, on the face of it, wasn't seeing enough of it to satisfy me.
Maybe one follow-up question, a bit broader, drawing on your experience both at the Justice Department or just in your career generally, what do you think that compliance departments are either doing well these days, or where you see difficult areas and problems of concern you really wish we could solve? Like, what are we doing good and what are we doing not as good?
I think it's hard to generalize because there really is a great divergence of companies in terms of their sophistication of their compliance programs. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it will depend on the level of sophistication of the compliance officers companies have. So I think what a lot of compliance programs are getting good at is I think they do. I mean, most compliance officers out there, I think, have a basic understanding of the component, what the essential components of a basic compliance program would look like. I think a lot of them, again, judging from a lot of conferences that I have attended or presentations I've seen, they're good at talking the old talk, which is, oh yeah, we'll do tone from the top, we do training, we do third-party due diligence. But I think what on the flip side, what I think has a lot of room for improvement is where really thinking through beyond these buzzwords, what does it really mean? I used to, when I was at Justice Department, I actually one time did a training where I actually printed out on purpose and again, upsetting the own environmentalist in me, that I printed out the travel regulations that govern government employee travel. And it prints out to be quite a good thick stack. And in a training with the prosecutors, I held up these, documents, and I said, "Are any of you familiar with the, whatever CFR code number, blah blah blah?" Mm-hmm. And I get the no, we don't know what you're talking about. I said, "These are travel regulations that all of you travel, all of you have, actually been governed by these regulations. Have you ever gone out to read it?" Of course nobody has. I ask lawyers all the time, when was the last time you read the Constitution from beginning to end? Not just the Bill of Rights, the whole Constitution. And I'm asking this of lawyers. This is not like people, random people on the street. Nobody's read them. So when companies come in and, to talk about their code of conduct, or people talk about this at conferences, what does it really mean for your employees that you have a good or bad code of conduct? Does anybody actually read it and know what it means to them on a day-to-day level? So I think really getting beyond the buzzwords of all these industry jargons that we throw around, and actually asking, what does it mean for our individual employees as they face decisions that they have to make every day? I think that's something that we could all do a lot better on.
Okay. And then last question about the guidance is, this was launched certainly in a very low-key fashion, posted on the Fraud Section website on a Friday afternoon. Why didn't the Justice Department give this more fanfare? It's a very rich source of information for the compliance community.
So I can only point to a few facts and give you my own conclusion. My first draft of this document was dated January 21st, 2016. In February of 2016, Andrew Weissman announced at a speaking engagement that Fraud Section would publish a list like this. It had been used extensively internally throughout 2016. Then on January 13th, 2017, Leslie Caldwell left as the Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division. Then in early February, the document went up without fanfare. I personally believe this document would never have seen the light of day but for Andrew Weissman's persistence, ingenuity, and courage.
Well, all right. We are certainly glad that however it got out there, it did see the light of day, because it's very useful intelligence for compliance officers. But Hui Chen, that is all the time we have on this podcast today. Thank you very much for your time. You covered a ton of ground for us, and we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Matt, and continue to do the good work that you do.
Thank you.
That's all for this episode of What's Next in Compliance. I'm your host, Matt Kelly. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you again next time.